Hello everyone. In this session, the sociologist, commentator and author Frank Furedi and I will be discussing what's been driving the conflict between Hungary and the EU, digging beneath the headlines and asking what it tells us about today's culture wars. My name's Joan Hoey and I'm the Director for Europe at the Economist Intelligence Unit, a sister organisation of the Economist newspaper. I've been working at the Economist for 25 years now, and actually I owe my career in large part to Frank, who's probably forgotten about this, but about more than 30 years ago, in the late 80s, when I was a journalist mainly covering UK and British politics, Ireland, Frank suggested that I should specialise in something else, which was Eastern Europe. So I took myself off to the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, SEAS, and started reading about what was going on in places like Poland and Hungary, this indecipherable country with an impenetrable language. And a few years later, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was a bit less ignorant than all the other journalists who floated off down the Danube to Budapest and beyond. So, here we are again, 30 years later, and what a difference in the way the media views Hungary, Frank. Hungary in 1989 was a poster boy, and so was Viktor Orban, in fact, for democracy and freedom. And today, Hungary is routinely portrayed as an illiberal, authoritarian bastion of reaction. And its leader, Viktor Orban, has been called the most dangerous man in Europe. So what's going on? How has Hungary morphed into, if we're to believe the media and commentators across Europe, this kind of quasi-dictatorship, the bad boy of Europe? What's gone on?
Well, I think the most important development that has occurred is that over the last 30 years, Hungary has developed a very strong sense of itself as a sovereign nation. And I think the distinguishing feature of Hungarian public life is the conviction that being a sovereign nation means that you get to decide your laws, you get to decide the values that you live by, and that therefore the influence that you allow yourself to be subjected to is to some extent minimized. And I think one of the things that has occurred is that a lot of people I know in Hungary, who are politicians, who are involved in the cultural industry, have come to realize that the promise of the West, which appeared to be brilliant 30 years ago, was illusory, that Western societies, contrary to what was said, didn't have all that much to teach Hungary, because most Western NGOs and most Western politicians would come to Hungary as if Hungarians were a bunch of uneducated savages who needed to be shown the ways of life and to get a bit of civilization. They basically decided that they didn't want to be put into this neo-colonial position, and they began to kick up against the European Union, which they're part of. And I think one of the things that the Western media doesn't like about Hungary is that the values that Orban and others are putting forward are almost the opposite, culturally speaking, politically speaking, to the ones that prevail in Brussels and prevail particularly in Northern Europe. And I think that's what has changed. And the interesting thing is that now Hungary is being held to an entirely different standard than any other nation in Europe. I mean, the stories you hear are sometimes acquire a Harry Potter fantastic character. If you can just give one example. A few months ago, I was involved in a debate at the Frontline Club on Hungary. And Jonathan Dimbleby, who you probably all heard of, is meant to be a national treasure. So was chairing, but he wasn't really chairing it. He was there to attack Hungary, and he ended up the debate as a chair with a 10-minute rant where he basically said, and these were his words, I've been to the Congo, and I've been to Latin America, and I've been to Hungary, Budapest, and I often felt unsafe, and I felt that this was a very insecure society. And all that I could see, come to Budapest, and it is the safest city in Europe that I know of. I'm saying that not because I'm Hungarian, but it just so happens that you don't need to worry too much about anything like that. And the idea that, and afterwards I said to myself, Dimbleby probably really believes that when he was in Budapest, he was in the jungle, that this was like a very dangerous kind of thing. And that's because they got in their head that anybody that believes in sovereignty and believes in values that are different than his represents some kind of a threat to him.
I mean, you often get this sense that it's this conception of what is going on there, and also to some degree in Poland as well, although Hungary is the country that seems to be in the front line of this attack, is that it's our way, the European way, or it's barbarism. It's like it's a kind of really visceral feeling that this is somehow some kind of existential threat emanating from this part of the world. So I just wanted to maybe probe that a bit deeper. You say that essentially it's all about an assertion of sovereignty, so we can talk maybe a little bit later about how that has come about, and how even Orban, as somebody who started as somebody on a Soros scholarship, as he was at the time, to Oxford, and then came back and was involved as a student in the changes that took place in the end of the 80s, how his trajectory has really moved. But let's probe this idea of a illiberal democracy a bit more. I mean, that's something that Viktor Orban, in a speech a few years ago, said that he was seeking to create in Hungary, that this was a positive thing, actually, to create this illiberal democracy. And I think it's something that's been probably misquoted or misinterpreted. Can we talk a little bit about what he was really proposing when he talked about that? What did he really mean?
Well, I think there are two things. I think he used the word illiberal quite provocatively to get a bit of attention, because he was kind of fed up with being told off for not sharing the values of the European Union. And what Orban really meant when he talked about being illiberal democracy, is that there is more to life than just liberalism. And by that, what he meant is that liberalism, in the way that it's understood in the European Union, is a very technocratic form of liberalism. I mean, liberalism in the European Union is about process. It's about the rule of law. It's about respecting process. But the genuine values of liberalism, what I think are really good about liberalism, like tolerance, are conspicuously absent. If the European Union was tolerant, they would tolerate Hungary having values that are different to that of Brussels. If they were genuinely tolerant, then they wouldn't tell people who believed in a religious or a cultural outlook that differed from them as somehow being wrong or inferior to them. So I think that's what he was really getting at. And the point that he was, I suppose, trying to make is that there is something more than liberalism which is important, and that's the community. That there's got to be a set of values that kind of bind people together, that there are these pre-political senses of intergenerational continuity, that there are kind of this kind of historical memory which people, in a sense, internalize as they're kind of growing up. And being able to give some kind of an expression to the sense of community was really important, because you cannot have relations of trust, you cannot have relations that are integral to a democratic life. You cannot have a demos in the Greek sense unless that demos is founded upon a shared set of meanings, a common web of meanings, which has always played that kind of central role. And I think that the reaction against that comment of his is partially against the term illiberal democracy, but it's much more to the fact that he's basically saying that community comes before anything else.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's really been lost in the reaction. So it was a provocative use of the word, and it got the reaction probably that he wanted, but in the process, it's actually what he was really trying to say maybe has been lost in translation, because that's what I took it to mean. What he was essentially saying was that the most important unit of society was not the individual per se, but the community. And then he put forward this idea of the state. Actually, the role of the state is to play have a kind of idea of where the nation should be going. It must respect civic rights. We can talk about that, whether it does so or not. But views the community as the basic unit of society, and on that basis the state should promote community, sovereignty, he says self-sufficiency, culture, heritage, and so on. So he's basically saying there's not a one-size-fits-all vision of democracy. And is it that really that Brussels cannot accept, that there's only this way, there's no other version that's acceptable, and that he's therefore seen as an anti-democrat? He's saying that he's a democrat, but it's...
Well, except for the fact that Brussels doesn't do democracy well. I mean, Brussels is a little bit alienated from the whole process of democracy. It's got a robust track record of ignoring people's aspirations whenever there's a referendum in Ireland or Holland or France. It kind of pretends it didn't really exist and asks them to re-vote again. I think that Brussels is interesting because, you see, they criticize Prime Minister Orban for his use of the word illiberalism. But I think that the best characteristic, the way you could easily characterize the politics of the Brussels political establishment, is that they are illiberal liberals, in the sense that their conception of liberalism is a very, very narrow one. But in terms of their practices, in terms of the practices of genuine liberalism, that's not something that they take too seriously. And I think that one of the therefore, I often think that the choice at the moment seems to be between illiberal liberalism on the one hand and what Orban playfully called illiberal democracy. And I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, the key issue is democracy, particularly democracy in its majoritarian form. I mean, that's what they don't like about Hungary, that there is a kind of Orban government that's based upon what's called a supermajority, based on the fact that there is that once the majority decides, then there is far less sort of pushback against that than you would have in England or in America or other societies.
Yeah, and I like this counterposition that you made between, the denunciation of the liberal democracy of Hungary and the liberal democracy of the EU, because often the criticism of Viktor Orban and his government, and he's been in power now for 10 years in this recent phase, is that they're criticizing his also centralizing tendencies, top-down approach, which is exactly what the whole European project is all about, really, and the exclusion of the demos from playing any role. But I suppose we need to ask the question: is there not a danger in defending what is happening in Hungary, that you're defending the indefensible? After all, he has strengthened executive power at the expense of Parliament. He's weakened other checks and balances. He's made political appointments to institutions willy-nilly. He's established control of swathes of the media. He's encouraged anti-immigrant prejudices. Well, these are the nature of the criticisms that are often made of the government in Hungary. So should we not be concerned at some of the things that are going on?
Well, obviously, it's always important to look at things very carefully and not to accept what people say as the final word on it. And obviously, politicians in any society are not angels, and they can get carried away, they can make mistakes. But I think there's some very interesting developments. If you take, for example, there's a charge that's often made that Hungary is this very authoritarian state. And you almost get the impression that it's moving towards a kind of fascist dictatorship. And then you look at it, sort of a few weeks ago, there were elections in Hungary, and the opposition managed to win Budapest, which is, one of the most important city in Hungary. And you look at some other cities where the opposition managed to win. And it's very, very clear that if you look at the actual procedures that are followed, they're no better, no worse than they are in any other European societies. And I thought it was interesting that all the media in England and elsewhere were celebrating the fact that the opposition had won the elections, the local elections. But they didn't say that maybe that means that there is a bit of democracy after all. That was not a message that they wanted to put forward. So I think that there is a kind of double standard. The double standard comes out most clearly in relation to the whole idea of centralization. Now, let me give you an example of what's happened in Hungary. The European Union has criticized the Hungarian government for infringing on the independence of the judiciary, primarily because it weakened the power of the constitutional courts. And it did that. The constitutional courts, their power has been much weaker. But then when you look at it, you ask the question, well, what is the constitutional court? Well, the constitutional court was set up after regime change, after the old communist regime left. The constitutional court was set up with one project in mind, and the project was to limit the power of parliament, to minimize. That is a counterforce to the way that parliament works. And in fact, the first head of the constitutional court in Hungary, actually, his name was Hoey, actually said that sometimes we in the constitutional court displace the idea of we the people with the idea of we the judges. And he considered the fact that actually in 1991, the Constitutional Court had more power than Parliament did in terms of blocking legislation, in terms of influencing the future course of event. Now, I got no problems in weakening the power of such an unelected institution which infringes on the rights of democracy. I think that's an entirely legitimate sort of thing to do. And that in no way means that the legal system is no longer the rule of law no longer exists. There's no longer an independent judiciary. It means that the judiciary in Hungary was depoliticized. But the way it was presented was very different. Forgetting the fact that many European countries don't have a constitutional court. Not every European country's got a constitutional court for a very good reason, that parliamentary systems take parliamentary sovereignty so seriously that they don't need to have a supreme court like the one we just recently invented in England, because they think there's other ways of managing sort of political debates. And that's a legitimate discussion. Do we need a constitutional court or do we not? And I'm open to discuss it. But what I'm not open to is to give it a political role that gives it sovereignty over parliament.
Okay, when you look at what's going on in Western Europe and the rise of populist movements in recent years and what's happening in Eastern Europe in places like Hungary and Poland and elsewhere, do you see more similarities in the kind of political trends and developments, or do you see also important differences?
I think there's one similarity, which is that for the first time since the 1930s, a significant section of European society is becoming concerned about the right of sovereignty, both national sovereignty but popular sovereignty. I think democracy was something that we kind of rhetorically paid lip service to in recent decades, but for a lot of people, democracy is beginning to have some kind of a meaning. It's something that they feel is integral to their lives. And I think in that sense, that transcends the East-Western divide. There are some very big differences because, contrary to the way that it's presented, the Hungarian government is not a populist government. It calls itself a Christian conservative government. That's what its politics is. If any of you know anything about politics or history, the government in Hungary is not unlike the Adenauer government in Germany or the Christian democratic government in Italy in the past. It's got a lot of similarities with Gaullism, Charles de Gaulle's kind of national kind of project, and that's the ballpark within which it is. And it calls itself, quite self-consciously, uses the Hungarian word, which when you translate to English means we're a bourgeois party. It basically means that we're for, bourgeois in the Central European sense means something different. It means that we're for the citizens, for the kind of educated citizens of society. So it's not a populist party at all, even though it's called that. But it shares the aspirations for sovereignty with Italians and whatever, and the French. And I think what's very interesting is that a lot of populist movements in Europe now look up to Hungary. The first time that Hungary is seen as not just a kind of a third-rate country where you can eat goulash, but it's seen as being sort of far more significant, having a greater cultural and political role as a result of that, for better or worse, depending on what you think.
Mm. Yeah, that's right, I think, because Hungary and Orban, they have lots of enemies, but they also seem to have won some admirers as well. And like you say, it's not just in Poland and Russia and Turkey and places like that. It's also in Western Europe. So it's very interesting what you say, actually, that this isn't populist. It's actually got a lot of similarities with governments from the past. And this is a country where, and a party that's been re-elected 3 times. I mean, that doesn't happen very often these days in Europe. Fidesz has managed to win 3 consecutive elections by a landslide in some of them. So what is the secret of his success? Is it to do with this appeal to the nation and sovereignty, or is there something more going on?
Well, I think the Hungarian ruling party, the Fidesz party, has been blessed by an unusually inept opposition. I think if you look at the Hungarian opposition, it's called left-wing. It's not really left. It's kind of I think it shares the European Union's technocratic ambitions with a kind of sublimated form of identity politics that is trying to kind of sort of cobble together. Opposition is very confusing. I mean, just to give you an example, in the recent elections, the reason why they won is because the left, as it's called, joined together with the far right, the Jobbik party, and they were tactically voting. And that is something that nobody comments on in The Guardian, who if imagine for 1 second, if the Labour Party in this country came to an electoral agreement with the British National Party, which is what Jobbik is, there'd be a few murmurs about it, that this is maybe not the best way forward. But when it comes to Hungary, that's cool because it's against the Fidesz government. But anyways, Fidesz has been blessed by an unusually inept opposition, which has really helped. But also, I think Fidesz has done 2 things. I think Orban, whatever you think about his politics, is an unusually talented politician. He's the only prime minister I know in Europe that can give an hour speech without using notes. He can talk extemporaneously, using humor and everything else. But most interesting about Orban is that, again, what he also has is this capacity to look to the future. He's always thinking of where is Hungary going. So his game is not about what's going on now. His game is really about how can Hungary survive as a future-oriented, technologically and culturally developed nation. That I think that message gets across, sort of to society. And I think that those 2 factors, where you have a kind of you have a political vision, not just simply crunching numbers as we have in England, plus the fact that the opposition has been so weak, has meant that he's been able to create a new political class, which is very different from the old Hungarian political class, the post-communist political class.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting because actually there's very few places where you can see politicians or a political party or a government or an individual even that has some sense of a forward-looking vision, some sense of a kind of alternative route other than the EU, especially in that part of the world. We've just had a situation where President Macron of France has vetoed any further enlargement effectively there was a decision taken about Albania and North Macedonia. And Macron's position, which is nobody should have been surprised because that's been his position now for 2 years, that we need to get our own house in order before we invite more guests, from Eastern Europe. And you think, what will be the reaction of those countries now to this? And unfortunately, there aren't any in the Western Balkans governments that you can see have got any clue actually how to respond, how they should respond, other than being the kind of victim or something. So it's unusual that you have this in Hungary, probably more so than in Poland as well. Just so we can maybe talk about that a bit more, because it's also rare in the West as well. There's some kind of template of development that we're all meant to follow, of democracy and a national path and so on. And nobody has really questioned that for a very long time. So it's interesting that it's emerged in these countries. Now, Orban famously once said, there is life outside the EU. That was actually back in, I think, 2002, before Hungary joined the EU, and when he was in his first stint as Prime Minister, and he was annoyed that the accession process was taking so long. So he's been scathing about the EU, and he's still scathing about the EU, but he's never advocated leaving it. So why is that? Is that simply a case of him wanting to have his cake, EU funds and so on, and eat it, or what is that? What?
Well, I think everybody in this room likes to have their cake and eat it too, right? That's part of the human spirit, that we're all like that. I think Orban, although he's a very politically and intellectually sort of focused individual, is also very pragmatic. In fact, he comes across as one of the most pragmatic individuals. I don't think he could have won 3 elections and survived the tempest that exists in East Europe if he wasn't so kind of pragmatic. And I think that Orban realizes that Hungary cannot just simply say goodbye to the European Union, without there being a very heavy cost to that, and he's not prepared to pay that. And I know for a fact that he's very unhappy that Britain is leaving the EU, understands why Britain wants to leave the EU, but he figures that Britain was one of the potential allies that he had. And he also realizes something that actually quite disturbs me, which is that given the fact that what he stands for is, and the way he goes about it is so rare, he also actually understands that Hungary cannot survive promoting a sovereign political project for very much longer. That the pressures upon Hungary, the people in the European Union that want to get Hungary, I mean, there was a very interesting judicial decision just very recently, which basically is all about just, we've got to get Hungary, we've got to get these people, sort of, and punish them for what they are. I think Orban realizes that given the geopolitical balance of power, unless that there is a large European nation like Italy or France or somebody else that backs Hungary, it's going to be very, very difficult for Hungary to indefinitely pursue this independent strategy. And I think that for that reason, he's really hoping that kind of more friendly populist movements will gain power. I think he's very pessimistic about Germany. I think Germany has, sort of really disappointed him in that kind of respect. But that's what I see as being an interesting future development. I mean, I don't think that Hungary can do this indefinitely unless the balance changes a little bit within Western Europe.
Yeah, well, I guess that's preempted my last question, which was, are there limits to the Orban project, if you want to call it like? We've talked a lot about Orban, and actually, I think you have to, because he is the kind of personification of what is perceived to be the problem with Hungary, but he's also, as you say, quite a unique politician. So maybe we should finish on this point about, because it's a bit bleak, to think that, having said there is life outside the EU, actually, have we learned that there really, isn't for some countries? Yeah, there might be for a country like the UK, which has got the weight and economic weight and everything else to make a go of it, but we might be questioning that given what's happened for the past few years. But for all these ones, outside of the G7 or something, have they got the capacity to forge a different path? So I think a lot of people are still watching what the outcome of Brexit is going to be. So, thinking ahead, in 5 years' time, do you think the EU project is going to look a bit different than it does today? What does that depend on?
Well, I mean, you raised some very difficult questions. I'm on balance optimistic, because if what Hungary is doing can converge with the spirit of our times, and there's a spirit of search for new political answers that exists all over Europe. If somehow those things can coalesce and reinforce one another to move in a similar kind of direction, then I think there could be some very positive outcomes. I'm quite pleased that, for example, Hungary has established a very close political relationship with Slovakia and Poland and the Czech Republic, and we 4 countries are, when you put them all together, they are no longer a simple, poor East European country. They are quite formidable as an economic kind of unit. So I think that's a building block that they kind of doing. But also there are other things going on. I think the situation is very, very fluid in the Balkans. You know, sort of the role of Turkey is kind of changing all the time. I think there is a kind of new balance of power that's being established. I think the situation in the Ukraine, which is on the eastern borders of Hungary, is really fraught with tensions at the moment. The Hungarian minorities in the Ukraine are getting a really hard time. Their rights to Hungarian language schools and other things, cultural rights are being taken away. So there's a kind of there's a kind of a very kind of interesting, fluid situation that has developed. And I think under those circumstances, if you know what it is that you're striving to attain, which is the one thing that marks out Hungary at the moment, then the possibility of realizing your objective is not bad. And for that reason, on balance, I think that's really, we can be fairly optimistic. But at the same time, realism is called for. And we have to realize that the forces against the Hungarian experiment are very, very powerful, and they dominate global culture at the moment, and that's very difficult to resist and fight against.
Okay, thanks, Frank. I think we've spoken now for about half an hour, so I think this is a good time to open up the discussion to you, the audience.
Frank, I'd like to bring you back to some of the things that you said in the last session about the importance of understanding history, amongst other things, and what I would call social solidarity. I think there's a very important point that hasn't been raised up till now. I say this, by the way, as a half Hungarian. Hungary is a little bit anomalous in the European picture because it's basically still a tribal society. Hungary is Magyar in a way that you don't find in most of the other European countries. Italy was a conglomeration of all sorts of nation states. France, well, it came together, fortunately, as a single state. Germany was city-states as well for a long time. Hungary has a sort of national myth that makes it very different from the rest of Europe, and I think this is one of the reasons why it has a much stronger sense of national identity and is resented by the EU as being a sort of outsider. By the way, I also live in Israel, which is another tribal society, and is very much resented by other parts of the world because it's different. How do you see this, and how do you see this developing in the future?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. Why is it Hungary? Why is it Poland? Why is it the Visegrad Four that actually have a bit more about them? Is it to do with the Austro-Hungarian legacy, a longer history of statehood and so on, and this national myth? That's interesting. But I'll take a couple more questions before I get Frank to come back.
One way of looking at a lot of the current conflicts is that in politics is it's between people who still believe that the nation state is the primary identity, and those people who are committed to still the nation state but within a broader sort of political or larger political entity. From what you said, it seems like you'd be more in favour of the nation state still as the primary political entity. And I want to ask you about if you understand why people are committed to perhaps moving to a broader kind of entity, and although it's fair to say that MAPS is that it's less democratic in the case of the EU, but there is something valuable about moving beyond the nation state, and that this isn't the end of human history. The nation state isn't the last best thing we could ever have.
Okay, thank you.
This is going to be a short question, but also about history. Hungary lost half its population and 2/3 of its territory through the 1920 Treaty of Trianon. How much do Hungarians actually want to regain those parts of Romania, Slovakia, possibly Ukraine? And how much is it just the perception of the neighbours that the Hungarians want to get their minorities back and their territory back?
I'm going to bring Frank back in, but I will, if there's anybody else who's got a kind of history question.
It's sort of related and about the internal dynamic. I just wondered about, there's a monument in one of the squares that protesters have said that was put up in secret, which is an eagle, which was meant to represent the evil of Germany. And protesters have said that Orban has put that up in secret, and it's a celebration of their solidarity with the Germans during the German, when they were on the side of the Germans, and that they're ignoring the Jewish heritage and what the Jewish people went through. And I just wondered whether historically this is a problem for them in terms of the internal dynamic of being able to move away from being responsible and feeding into the EU kind of idea of history starting with the Holocaust and ignoring the fact that they were under Soviet occupation. Whether there's some kind of new dynamic going on there, does it make sense?
Okay, thank you. Glad somebody's raised the Jewish question in relation to Hungary. The lady with the green beret there.
So there was a mention of Austro-Hungarian Empire, and may I also introduce the Ottoman Empire and Israel's history, which is more than 3,000 years old. So which bits of history are we allowed to refer to in our debates?
Well, I think the question of historical memory is really quite important, and I think one of the big differences between the Hungarian idea of historical memory and the Western European one is that in Hungary, history doesn't begin in 1945 in the way that it does in Europe, where it's the Second World War is history. Everything before Second World War is seen as the past. It's kind of generic past. I think in Hungary there's a much kind of greater focus and greater emphasis. And I think we need to take into account the experience of the Ottoman Empire. It's very, very important. I think it's only if you understand that Hungary has been under Turkish occupation for a very long time that you can understand why it's not very keen on migration, that it takes its independence very, very seriously. Hungary has been occupied by the Turks, by the Russians, by the Austrians, by the Germans. So it would like a bit of time when it's not occupied by anybody else and it's able to decide for itself, what its kind of borders are. Those are really very important things. I think the point you make about the origins is really quite important. There's a big debate going on in Hungary between, it's much easier in Israel, where everybody knows what the origins are. It's in the Bible, and it's very, very clear. In Hungary, it's become a major focus of debate. But I think you raised one very important question. I think it is very interesting that although Israel is a very different country than Hungary, they both get very similar treatment in terms of the media. And I think the kind of the animosity that is expressed towards Israel and the animosity expressed towards Hungary is due to the fact that both of these societies have a kind of robust sense of nationhood, and they're not prepared to buy into some of the kind of very fashionable federalist, globalist kind of ideals that are really, really very, very strong. And I think that there is life beyond the nation. You're absolutely right. But I think at the current moment, I've always been drawn towards internationalist, sort of sensibilities. I consider myself a man of the Enlightenment. Universalistic outlook is very, very important to me. I think that morally, Immanuel Kant's ideas about humanity as being one, and we have obligations towards human beings are really very important. But I think there's a difference between our moral sensibilities and the fact that, whether we like it or not, the reason, amongst other things, why nation is important is because up till now there's been no other framework within which you can begin to have a situation where democracy can work. You cannot have a democratic society without a demos, and you cannot have a demos unless it's territorially bounded, unless there is some kind of space within which this occurs. And this is a discovery that the ancient Greeks already made, when in the ancient Greek language, nomos, which means the law, was used as a synonym for boundaries. And the idea was that the law and boundaries intertwine, because it's only within a particular kind of space that public debate and conversation can occur. And it seems to me that the attempt at the moment to privilege what's called sort of international civic society or transnational institutions as somehow having a moral authority that's beyond that of the nation state is actually a very negative, regressive force, because whoever runs the IMF or the United Nations or NATO or any of these open society foundations, these are not people that are accountable to anybody, right? They might be wonderful people, they might be very nice people, but nobody elected them, they're not accountable to anybody, but yet they take it upon themselves to tell the world how they should live their lives, what kind of values they should have. And I think in that sense, at the moment, I would say that it's very important to take national sovereignty seriously. I would not have said this if I was living in 1848 or whatever, because I think that there were other ways of going forward. I think today, when we have this very corrosive globalist pressure upon the world, I think national sovereignty has acquired a tremendous amount of both political and moral significance.
There's quite a few more hands, I think, so let's start at the back.
When you were describing Mr. Orban's government, you described it as conservative and Christian. To what degree do you think the antipathy towards Hungary from the European Union is because it is avowedly Christian and the European Union is aggressively secular?
Thank you. And there's one on the other side there. Well, there's a few there. Let's take them.
Could you define or describe fascism?
Quick question. What's the history of the animosity behind Orban and George Soros?
Okay. I knew that question would come up.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the like-minded governments of Visegrad, the 16+1 with China now 17+1, and what impact, if they become like-minded with policies, that could have on reform or not with the European Union.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman there.
Thank you for the talk. Do you think that the constant changes in the European politics could ultimately damage the European economy in terms of like funding or allocation of resources?
Frank?
I really like the question about fascism because what has happened is that in the 21st century, the word fascism has come to be used as anybody who you don't like, or anybody with, who's not particularly left-wing, or, anybody with bad breath is become a fascist. I know. I didn't say you said that. I just putting it in context. I think fascism is going to be a term that's used very carefully because it refers to a particular historical experience, and the precondition for fascism was the destruction of civil organizations. It was the destruction of the labor movement. It arose principally first in Italy, which is the classical fascist country, as a way of basically of destroying the political public sphere as it existed, and putting in its place a kind of authoritarian government whose constitution was self-consciously one that insulated the political classes from that of the demos, from the people. I think, fortunately, at the moment, I know of no fascist countries in Europe. There may well be. I think fascism existed in a particular historical context, and I just made the point that we got to have a sense of historical specificity in terms of what that means. And if it's quite okay for not liking countries or movements, but maybe you should have a different name for them that kind of approximates to what they really are. I think the question that was raised about Christianity and the Christian value is pertinent. It is very interesting. And I say this as somebody who's new to the study of this question, the extent to which when you talk to MEPs in Brussels and you mention the word Christian, they kind of, get this kind of visceral hatred, even though they themselves, sort of grew up in a Christian family. But there seems to be this belief that if you're Christian, somehow your religion is more xenophobic and more racist and more narrow-minded than any other religion in the world. I mean, Christianity is kind of often picked out in this. But I think the real reason why Hungary has been put into that mix is because in the constitution and elsewhere, there are pre-political values, that's to say values that have got to do with Hungarian culture that are put to the foreground. And that's very alien and very, very foreign to the way that the European Union sees things. On the Jewish question, I just to come, because I didn't answer that earlier on, I think that's a very real question. It's always been a very real question in East Europe. But I do think there's a very real double standard there. I mean, Hungary is often portrayed as being a uniquely anti-Semitic society that has never come to terms with its past. I think that Hungary, like any other society, has got its share of anti-Semites. They exist in every part of the world. But the one thing that I found particularly interesting, and it was really brought home to me, we were walking around Budapest last month with my family, and my family is English, Hungarian. And we noticed that everywhere we went in Budapest, there were these posters about Jewish Cultural Month. And my wife, Anne, was making the point, isn't this interesting? If this was in London, there would be anti-Semitic comments there, right? There would be, they would be defaced and all kinds of things would be written on it. And I thought that was the other interesting thing is, if you go to a Jewish restaurant in Budapest, unlike a Jewish restaurant in Brussels or in Paris, there are no police guards, right? You don't have to protect them, or Berlin for that matter. You don't have to protect them against people, sort of doing bad things. That doesn't happen. And yet, when you go to Paris or Brussels, it's unthinkable that you would have a Jewish restaurant with kind of Stars of David, and there being no security there, or security concerns not being particularly important. And yet, there seems to be this fantasy that we're living in a uniquely anti-Semitic society in Hungary, which I think bears very little relationship to reality. I think the fact of the matter is that we have a universal problem of anti-Semitism, but that Hungary is held to a different standard and is criticized in a way that kind of no other society is. Which brings me to my point about Orban and Soros. Now, Hungary gets criticized because it waged a campaign against Soros, who runs the Open Society Foundation, this billionaire who's very active in politics throughout the world. And because Soros happens to be Jewish, the argument was that it's done for anti-Semitic reasons. And I've written about this, and I argue that probably the only unobjectionable thing about Soros is that he's Jewish, right? Everything else, I think, is a little bit problematic. I mean, you have to remember that Soros was able to set up his organization in 1984. That's before regime change. In other words, the communist Stalinist regime was still in power in Hungary, but for some mystical reason, Soros was able to set up his institutions 4 or 5 years before the transition to a non-communist, a more democratic society kind of occurred. And people are asking questions, how was he able to do this? This is an incredible accomplishment. And the reason why they ask that question is because Soros has been able to play a disproportional role in influencing the political dynamic of regime change everywhere in East Europe, but particularly Hungary. I mean, you made the point that Orban himself had a Soros scholarship to Oxford, where anybody that moves had a Soros scholarship. I mean, he bought up anybody with a half a brain cell. I mean, that's what Soros did in Hungary. And I think that for that reason, he did have a disproportionate political impact over there. And he has been very active in promoting the European Union's political outlook in Hungary. And he's, for that reason, there's been a lot of tensions and arguments. And I think it's very interesting to come back to your point. But Soros, even though he's Jewish, plays a comparable role in Israel, where within Israeli societies, he's set up all these NGOs and everything. And I think that he's also played a very similar role in terms of arguing that Israel, the Jewish identity in Israel should be kind of toned down a little bit, which is more or less what he's saying in relation to Hungary.
Thank you, Frank. We've got about 10 minutes, well, actually, a little less. So I'm going to take a last round of questions.
You mentioned about Orban's focus on the future of Hungary, and particularly when my concerns are, with his strengthening of the executive powers and particularly focus towards Hungarian identity, is there not a risk that he follows trends like in Russia with Putin, that there might be like a tend towards irredentism, particularly following Trianon?
Yes, I'm just wondering whether there's anything about Mr. Orban's government that you're not happy with, any criticisms you have to make, because we haven't actually heard those yet.
Frank, I know a lot of your work has been on fear, so I just wondered how you relate to the concept of fear to this current concern about Hungary.
I want to comment on a point that Frank made about I guess it was a social democratic, some type of party in Hungary that collaborated with a far-right party, and that created a complete chaotic message that obviously was lost in the Hungarian elections. I was wondering whether, of course, without neglecting the important differences between the two contexts, whether that could be another attempt to bring together supposedly left and far-right discourses in support of a pro-EU argument. And I was thinking another example could be what's happening in the UK in relation to the Brexit situation, where we have what I think is a far-right argument to revoke, to cancel the referendum, and also the arguments for a second referendum. I think, in my view, these are far-right arguments, although they are incorporated into a kind of more left-wing discourse. And I was wondering whether that combination is something that is emerging in some ways in Europe.
Okay, thanks. Before I bring Frank back in, then we've got to draw to a close. Just to save him, I'll try and answer a couple of questions there were about the kind of economic dimension. An obvious point you can make about all those countries, Hungary included, the Visegrad Four, but the East European region in general, so all the former communist Balkans as well as the Visegrads, is that they are highly dependent on the EU economy and some, particularly Germany. And you can say, looking back over the 30 years of this transition, that when the EU economy's done well, they've generally done well, and vice versa. And obviously we're heading into another slowdown in the Eurozone economy this year, next year. But the point I would make is that if you look at the kind of political discontent that has been evident for a long time in Eastern Europe, and particularly in the Visegrad countries, that actually predated the 2008-2009 crisis. Well, it hit that region with a lag in 2009. It was actually at the height of the boom in these countries that you saw the rise of, incredible political discontent with, the political situation there. And it's really in that period that I think things started to change, and particularly in Hungary, there was a reaction, against the EU that was not a consequence of the crisis. We've seen kind of key moments subsequently, the migration crisis and so on. So, to some degree, the politics is being driven by that whole process of accession and the relationship of then with the EU, and then the relationship with Brussels as member states. I think the point about some of the other countries that are still looking to join is that they are very peripheral countries. They are very weak. They're very poor. Their kind of orientation has been towards the EU, but they're also pretty open to influence of others, including Turkey, I would say particularly China. I mean, what China is doing, especially in the Western Balkans at the moment, is pretty incredible. And they're completely open to the influence of China. Why shouldn't they be actually, or anybody else for that matter? UAE investing in some of those countries as well. This has been the situation of these countries for the whole of the 20th century and the 21st century, periphery countries. And in that situation, unless you have some sense of identity and self-preservation and some kind of sense of yourself as a nation with some kind of, forward-looking development path, you are going to end up as a dependency of somebody else. So it's interesting that it's these particular countries where something different has emerged, which have got more of a sense of themselves. So I'm going to leave it to Frank to close the session and answer some of these last points.
Yeah, I mean, on your last point, it is very interesting. If you travel in the countryside in Slovenia, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, China is buying up all the land. I mean, it's interesting how you have all these influences coming in there, and we'll see what's going to happen in relation to that. I just want to kind of take a couple of the points that were raised. One is on irredentism. I don't think that Hungary has got any realistic desire to get back the territory that it lost in 1920. I think the objective of the Hungarian government is only one thing, which is to allow the communities, the Hungarian-speaking communities in these societies, to have language rights so that they can teach their children in the Hungarian language, and cultural rights so they can express themselves culturally. I think that's the only real objective that he has. He wants, I think it's really hoping that Hungarian cultural presence can continue into the indefinite future. That's its basic kind of objective, and that's really what most of the arguments are about. But nobody that I've met in Hungary has ever talked about changing borders. That's not a discussion. That was a discussion 50, maybe 80 years ago, but it isn't really the way these things are discussed at the moment. On the question is there anything that I disagree with? Well, as everybody knows me, I've never yet in my life agreed with everything that any government has said. In fact, I very rarely agree with almost anything that most governments say. And so I'm not here to basically argue and defend particular kind of policies, because, without a doubt, there are a lot of things that can be done differently in relation to education, economic policy, welfare measures in Hungarian society as in all Eastern European societies. My defense of Hungary is to do with the fact that what I'm really defending is the right of nations to self-determination. And what I'm really defending is the importance of the capacity of small countries in East Europe to follow their political vision in accordance with their own interests. And I think that to be able to do that and to kind of stand up for that in the way that Hungary has done is actually quite exemplary. I don't think that that's something that can be done forever. And I think the point that Joan makes about the impact of foreign influences is really very, very important in this respect, because I think that the way that certainly some people see their struggle is almost as a kind of anti-colonial struggle. I know it doesn't make any sense, because we think of anti-colonial struggles as ones that take place in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia. But certainly a lot of East Europeans see themselves as somehow kind of breaking away from the hold of some of the external kind of foreign pressures that kind of bear upon them. And I think anybody that has ever had any sympathy for the anti-imperial struggles of the past ought to look at Hungary in a much more favorable and positive light.
Okay, on that note, we're going to finish the session, and it just remains for me to thank Frank, my interlocutor, and to thank you all for your questions. Thank you all very much indeed.